collaboration, co-creation, co-design, and other types of rapidly emerging co-family recently has been gaining an increasing popularity in public sector. The proponents of these practices claim that instead of performing some tasks individually, we as employees or institutions could be working on them together. This could provide us richer information, unexpected attitudes and points of view, broader variety of skills and resources, and finally a higher support while implementing the collectively developed solutions. It is really fascinating to see that museums are not an exception from this case. Inclusion of museum communities in shared decision-making, or in other words, co-creation, is becoming a new fashion, or in some cases even the new normal of these institutions. Stella Toonen, a PhD candidate at King's College London, has been researching co-creation practices in Tate Modern in London, Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester and Queen's Museum in New York, to find out how co-creation is put in practice and what is its impact on the museums. She discovered that co-creation does not only directly affect the issue that it was focused on, but has a way much broader impact on the work practices, attitudes and culture in the institution. However, as it usually happens, it is not a low-hanging fruit and it comes with its own challenges. I'm really thankful for Stella, who agreed to share her experience and insights. And even though this time the meeting was not in a museum, but at home, I really hope you will enjoy listening to our collaboration. For the beginning, I was just wondering about the broadest question, I guess, about the role of the museum. How do you see it? How is it changing? And how did your experience made an impact on it? Because I saw that you have experience in really different museums. So I was just wondering how did that help to perceive what a museum is?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a huge question to think about kind of how museums are changing. And it also depends on how far you kind of zoom into that timeline. But I think what museums used to be is probably a kind of repository for objects, obviously, but also kind of for history and for documentation of what has happened before. And that has always traditionally been seen as a neutral space. We can come back to whether it really is that, but it's always kind of been a place that assumes knowledge, and that kind of that's really trying to say, you know, this is what you need to know about history, and that's why you go to a museum to learn about that. Or not history, it could be contemporary art, but you know, there's somebody who has decided what you should know about our culture and about our time and about what we think is important in society. And I think that's changing. I think people are putting question marks to that and saying like, well, who's actually deciding what goes in a museum, and thereby who's deciding what our culture should be and the stories that we should be telling about ourselves and about other people? And, you know, how come that there's only one voice, the curator's voice, or a few curators who decide on that? Because it's our culture together, and why can there not be more voices in there? So I think that's a change that has been happening a lot over the last few decades, but especially the last few years, where people have been really critical and gone like, well, we should do this differently, because it doesn't seem fair anymore, and it doesn't seem representative, and it kind of doesn't really seem acceptable anymore. But because of that, I think museums have kind of like been in a bit of a identity crisis, trying to figure out what else they could do if it's not this, or how they could do it differently to make it more up to date. And I think that has led to kind of lots of different things where museums have started to think about how can we have a different role in society? How can we be more relevant, mainly? How can we represent more people? And how can we be like have that space for discussion and create a conversation around what our culture should be, rather than saying this is what our culture should be. So it's become much more open, or at least they've wanted to become much more open, sometimes successfully, sometimes maybe not. And it's been a kind of shift in what their role is, and they've kind of gone from something that used to be a temple for art to something that's much more like a forum or a town hall, or a kind of, you know, discussion space where we can have these conversations and decide together what our culture and our kind of history and our stories should be. And I think that's a major change that you can, I mean, this is probably I would imagine this is a change that you will see still kind of, decades and centuries maybe onwards, where we've gone from a few centuries of being those temples for art to being a completely different type of thing, a completely different model of what a museum could be. And you could even wonder if the name museum is still up to date, because people associate that with that temple. And it's like, well, either we have to reclaim that name and turn it into something else, or maybe a new word would work better, because it's so fundamental, this change. And that's a really interesting one. And I think collaboration sits at the heart of that. But I'm sure we'll talk about that still. But yeah, that's very much part of it, I think.
Yeah, and I was wondering, when you mentioned that there is that big change needed, so what is the first step? Because like if you're working in a museum, well, I don't have so much experience with that, but I believe that it's really difficult to step out of that comfort zone that you're in and to do things in a different way that it was meant to do for, as you have mentioned, for a long years.
Yeah.
So where does the change happen? Where does it start to happen?
It's a very good question. It is really hard to come up with, it is really hard to come up with a proper big change, because you need real buy-in from the entire museum. Often that includes buy-in from all the top senior management, and also from funders and everybody else who keeps the museum going. So it's a question that sits much more widely than only within museum teams, but it also sits in policymakers and in fundraising and kind of all of the kind of the systems that we've built around museums as well. But it kind of big change can only happen if, like, it's often an accumulation of small changes. So it doesn't mean that as one single person in a team, and especially if you're maybe more junior as well, it doesn't mean that you can't make change. And I think I've seen incredible examples of people really kind of trying to make that change, and then seeing that other colleagues are inspired by it, and other colleagues starting to make the same changes. And then it kind of starts as a grassroots movement within that museum, where a director might suddenly go like, oh, it's actually really interesting what we're doing here. We should really invest in this. It's really having a huge impact, and it's got brilliant results so far. So let's invest in this. And then you get a kind of top-down investment in it too. And that's when you can build change together. But it kind of needs to start somewhere, and that can be a really tiny thing. And it can also be very different in different organizations, because you just mentioned, like, I've worked in lots of different types of museums, many of them quite big and bureaucratic, like big national museums. Some of them a lot smaller, or at least the teams that I was in were sometimes a lot smaller. And it's interesting to see the different types of change that you can have in these environments, because in some of the big ones, you think like, God, this is a lost cause, it's such a big bureaucracy. What difference am I going to make? But then you do see that actually you can make a real big difference, and you can inspire entire departments to start doing different things. And sometimes in small teams where you would expect like, oh, this should be easier, there's only a few people I need to convince, it'll be fine. Sometimes they can be like bound to all kinds of limitations because they are so small, and therefore your change doesn't go very far. So it can really happen anywhere, but it needs proper motivation and enthusiasm and perseverance in most cases, and then trying to get more people on board to make it more of a movement in a way, even if that's just an internal movement within your organization. Yeah.
But even with this, even if the change starts at one person, as you have mentioned, and his or her personal initiative, I guess there should be like a really strong determination. Okay, we really need to collaborate with our audiences. We need to involve them. And I guess that you were always one of those persons who were leading in the front of this idea. And I was wondering, how did you come up with this idea? How did you find this idea, and what inspires you to implement it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm convinced that museums can change, and that they should be changing, and there's lots of exciting ways that they can go. So I'm really kind of enthusiastic about the idea of change. There's also lots of people who are very hesitant and think like, oh no, change. I don't want any change. It was fine like this. Why do we need to change? And that's one of the biggest challenges, probably, to try and convince everyone that this can be a good change and that we can, go further. And I think often what helps is when people kind of, when they start new projects, and it can be quite experimental. And maybe at the beginning, people are a bit like, oh, well, will this be all right? Kind of how is it going to go? And they might be critical. But if you can then show that it actually has a great impact, or it's going really well, and you can have that evidence that, you know, this new way of working is actually working out really well, and is having much more of an impact on the people that you're working with, then it becomes easier to convince people that this should happen more. So I think gathering evidence could be a good way. And that's also what I'm doing by having become a museum researcher for now, at least in the PhD stage, to kind of combine my enthusiasm for change in my professional museum life with a kind of more evidenced approach as a researcher, where I can say, like, well, actually, I've looked at this for 3 years, and specifically co-creation is what I look at. And I think I was hoping that co-creation could lead to change before I started the PhD. But now that I've looked at it, I can actually say co-creation can be a catalyst for change. And it can be a really good way to try and get museums to change more, or at least to reflect more on what they're doing and where they might want to go next. So I have that more evidenced approach that is hopefully more convincing than just me saying, like, this is a good idea, but I don't know why. That's just my intuition telling me. So I think evidence could be a way forward. It's probably not the only way forward, but it's an approach that I've taken.
Yeah, before I'll start asking more about co-creation, I was really interested in what you said about evidence, because while preparing for this interview, I was thinking about the thing that I think there are some kind of trends in museums world. Like, there was that whole big trend with IT, let's make everything touchable, let's make everything interactive, and the more it shines, the more people will come to play with the exhibition. And now it seems that there is that new trend of co-creation. And with all those IT developments, I was a bit afraid that sometimes museum workers are not doing that very consciously. They're not using it as only a tool. They're using it as an end thing. Like, okay, we just make it interactive and that's enough. So I'm afraid, isn't there a danger with all those co-creation practices as well, that they will be just not used consciously, just like because everyone is doing that now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the biggest risk that you run when you try to set up a co-creation project, or probably any collaborative project, is the risk of tokenism. Like, if you say, I want to do co-creation, we're going to do a co-creation project, we'll call it co-creation, but then you don't actually let people collaborate with you properly in an equal way that is actually making an impact and actually gives them agency and, you know, makes it more equitable, then it's not a co-creation. And then you can call it that, and you can, you know, brag about the fact that you're doing a co-creation project and that you're so much kind of part of this new wave and this new change and the new hype, but then you're not doing it right, and that's only counterproductive. And then you get that co-creation gets a name of, you know, being quite vague and not always actually achieving what it's meant to do, and that's actually that really devalues the whole idea of co-creation and what it could be. So, and I think that's a real issue. I think there are lots of co-creation projects out there that are called that, but that are not actually doing co-creation, because the people involved in the projects, mainly the museum staff, is not really willing to actually hand over the control to collaborate in an equal way. Because I think co-creation is, it's a complete, it's a power negotiation. It's a method, really, more than an end goal. It's a process to try and get the established side, kind of the established museum staff community, to work together with a non-established community. So these could be individuals, then people who are non-professionals at museums. They often have like lots of lived experience, and they come into museums to bring in new voices. But to get these two groups to renegotiate that power balance and to go from, like, you know, established and non-established to something that's really much more equal in the middle, where both of the two groups can contribute expertise and ideas and have agency to shape the project. And it's a really tricky process, because it means that museum staff who've traditionally held all of the power in this project now have to give it away to the community to let them take part in the decision making around it. And, you know, if you're a curator and you've spent years and years trying to, you know, kind of, well, learning about your specialism, doing a PhD probably, and you finally get to curate your exhibition about your specialty and your kind of, well, all of your knowledge. and you have to say, actually, I'm going to invite a community and let them decide. That's a really scary thing to do. And it's something that a lot of museum staff are hesitant about. And I mean, I understand where that comes from. But if you then include a community and you say, well, actually, I might have the academic expertise, but this community has the lived experience, you can get so much more interesting results. And it's such an exciting process. But it's a scary thing to do, and it's not something that museums are usually set up for. I mean, all the structures and systems around museums and all the funders and the policymakers all make sure that, you know, when you start a project, you need to have the expert on board, and you need to have goals set out, and you need to have a plan for how you're going to do it. And in co-creation, all of these things are still open, because, you know, when you get your community involved and they get a chance to contribute ideas for how they want to run it, everything might change again. So it's a completely open-ended way of working. And that's not something that museums are very comfortable with, just because their systems are not set up in that way. So, you know, there's a lot of courage necessary to be okay with that, and to really invest in doing co-creation and commit to it. But I think when you do, it can be really powerful, but you have to do it well. You can't do it halfway and say that you're doing co-creation, because then you're just not doing it properly. And then it's not going to have the same effect.
It's very interesting what you say, because it seems that museums are so bureaucratic. Well, from the big scale, looking such a bureaucratic, such an institutionalized structure, and suddenly it's forced to do something that requires the most flexibility ever, I guess. So It's interesting how that reciprocal process goes, and then after co-creation, how the big structure maybe it also learns something. But I was also wondering about the thing when you mentioned about inclusion of communities and about established and not established structures. So I guess the process of the first steps of inclusion, it also should be very difficult, because those people, they have never had experience with museums, and suddenly someone comes from that big structure and says, please work with us. So maybe you could elaborate on that a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really tricky process, because if you go out into a community and you say, do you want to work with us? We need you for this project. It's that there is a power relationship in that already. I mean, if you as a museum person go out and you kind of ask them for a favor in a way, which kind of gives you all the power. And I mean, they can say no, I guess, but once they say yes, it's like you've asked them to do something, so you're in charge of what's going to happen. They often don't have the confidence yet to claim the agency and the space, because they'd be like, oh, well, it's a big museum, they have a big brand, I'm just this one single person and I'm not really sure what to do now. So there's a lot of responsibility on the museum person who's initiating this project, if they are initiating it. It can come from a community too, to really help that community member or that group to take that space and have the confidence to actually claim that space. And that's a really tricky process, and a lot of museum staff maybe don't know yet how to do it. If it's your first co-creation project, you just assume that people will take part maybe, and you realize that actually that's a lot harder. So there's a lot of projects, I think, that fail at that first hurdle already, because they just don't know yet how they can give other people that confidence and how they can include them properly. It's something I've seen at one of the case study museums that I did my research at, where they wanted to set up a community board, and they invited lots of people, like from groups that they had worked with a little bit already, but a lot of them were quite new to the museum and didn't really know what they were going to do. And they kind of planned a meeting, sat down with the board and said, so what would you like to do, to try and give them as much agency as they could? But the community didn't really know. They were like, what do we want to do? I don't know, you invited us, like kind of where do we start? And they said, it's fine, we'll take a few weeks, we'll talk about this and we'll have lots of discussion and see where we'll go. And they did that. And then after like 5 weeks or something, they asked again and said like, okay, so what as a board do you want to work on? You know, what agenda shall we set? And that community was still, they hadn't had the support to really kind of develop their thinking. They were just kind of left by themselves for those 5 weeks. And even after 5 weeks, they were still like, well, we don't really know. We have lots of ideas, but we don't know where to start or what to choose or how to kind of build a useful structure around this project. So the community then said, you know what, why do you not come up with an idea and we'll say if we like it? But then the museum staff was like, well, we could, but then it's not a co-creation project anymore. Then we're just consulting you, and that's really not an equal collaboration. So I think what everybody learned from that was that the museum staff realized that just asking people what they wanted is not enough. You have to ask them what they want and give them the tools to actually claim what they want, or to know what they want, or to have that discussion and actually decide what they want. But you can't just assume that somebody has an answer ready to that question, because it's an unsuspecting community who's not really involved with museums, and suddenly they have to have an opinion on something in the museum, or they have to know what they want to do, and they don't know the structures of it. And also for the community, they realized, like, actually we have to claim that space, even if it's scary and we don't know where to go yet. This is a really important thing for us to do. So then they started working together more and kind of did more of an introduction into the museum, and they had some guest speakers from different departments telling them what was happening and what they could be working on, and giving some examples. And that kind of more structured approach and kind of more informative approach that helped them to know more about the museum, that really helped them to then have a better idea of what they could be doing. So in the end it was fine, but it was a really interesting learning process, where it's like, well, it's not enough to ask what you want to do, but it's also not enough to then say, actually, we don't know, so you decide. Like, you have to try properly to build that equal collaboration, and it's a really difficult one to build.
It's very interesting what you mentioned, that it's a mutual learning, basically, from both sides. They don't know what will happen.
Yeah.
And I was also wondering, does it require like some kind of specific skills how to reach that audience? Because I believe there might be very, very different audiences. And what I found from your experience, I'm not sure if that is example that you would prefer, but I think it was called Conflict Cafe at the Imperial War Museum, and I was really fascinated by the topic and a very specific target group. So how was that experience?
Oh, that was amazing. But it's indeed kind of trying to find those communities is a really difficult one. And some museums have their own communities that they work with a lot. So it might be people that you've developed a relationship with over years already, and you might kind of keep working with them. Sometimes they go to a charity that already works with its own community, and to kind of, use that charity as an in-between person to reach out. Which is, I think, what happens probably in most cases, and also what happened with the Conflict Cafe, where we went to a refugee charity and said, we want to do a project around Syria. This was part of the Syria season at the Imperial War Museum in 2017, I want to say, maybe 2016, a few years ago. And we organised we called it a conflict cafe, which was really meant to be a space where we put lots of tables in the room, all like round tables, 10 chairs around each. And we had a big Syrian buffet, like lots of biscuits and tea and everything, all free. And we had invited a community of Syrians, many of them refugees, not all of them. Some were still seeking asylum, like different stages of their kind of journeys. And we asked all of those refugees and Syrians to sit down at those tables, but to have like one or two per table. And then we invited the general audience, like general visitors who happened to walk into the museum, or sometimes because they wanted to attend the event specifically, but generally just, kind of normal people, to take part and sit down at any of those tables and ask the Syrians any question they wanted to ask, really. I mean, we didn't prescribe anything. We had a few prompt questions in case you really ran out of things to talk about. But just, give people an opportunity to meet a Syrian, which many people haven't actually had the chance to do. Meet somebody with a refugee experience, which is a super intense experience that you almost never hear firsthand, because, in the news and in media, they're always talked about as some kind of homogenous group, but actually everybody has their own story. And to just have a genuine conversation, to hear what's been going on in their life. And, we were, like, as organisers, we were a bit worried, because we thought, well, what if we get lots of people who are against refugees, and we get all of these arguments? Do we need to get the riot police ready? Or what if we just get people asking really inappropriate questions or anything like that? But none of that happened, because it was such a genuine conversation, and people were so genuinely interested, that they became like really kind of powerful and interesting conversations, where people also felt like, I've now asked enough detail, I'm not going to go any further or won't push this. It just becomes a normal way of conversing with someone where you feel how it's going and where you can go with it. And people were so interested. And every table I sat down at, like, there were so many different stories, and all of them so powerful and so unique and so, intense. But lots of these people had, survived horrible things, but also some really beautiful stories of people turning out that they knew the same person back in Syria or something, And there were lots of visitors who came in who also had stories to share, and that's probably why they were interested in attending. But at some point, throughout those conversations, it wasn't even clear anymore who we had invited as a speaker and who was the audience. It just became a big conversation. And it was such a powerful afternoon, so inspiring, and it made so many connections between people who would otherwise probably not have a chance to meet, or not in that kind of genuine way. But that was because it was also collaborative and equal. Like, anyone in the space was allowed to be a speaker or a listener. We had some, people prepared in certain roles, but they didn't have to stick to them. So it became completely open for anyone to just take part and just take the space and the agency that they wanted to take, or just sit and listen, which was fine too. And we hadn't dictated where the conversation should go, but we'd left that completely open, and kind of, just whatever people asked was fine. And we kind of welcomed them and made it so accessible because, we had all the food and the drink, and it really felt like a cafe where everybody was welcome. And it was fine to just grab a tea and maybe only listen for 3 minutes and then walk away again. That's okay too. But it just made it such a kind of honest, equal, transparent, open-minded atmosphere that I've not always seen in museums. Well, that I haven't seen in museums very often. It felt like a really unique moment. So yeah, that felt like a very special project. Definitely, for me, a highlight of working at the Imperial War Museum.
Yeah, it's really amazing story, because now in Lithuania we have a big problem with migrants, with refugees. There is a lot of people coming, and I thought that would be really impressive to see something like that happening, especially in this context. And I was wondering, did you receive any feedback afterwards from both sides, or even from your colleagues in the museum? Did that change their attitude somehow?
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody on that day really loved it, and we did some kind of evaluation and stuff, and everybody was like, oh, this is so powerful and so different, and I've never done this at a museum before, but we should do this again. We did end up doing lots of them again, not just about, because that was part of the Syria season, but after that we had a season around terrorism. So we did another conflict cafe around terrorism and people who had survived terrorist attacks, which was also super intense, but so interesting and so powerful as well. But we also, and that's what I thought was most interesting, we got some people from the senior management who initially had been a bit like, oh, well, what are you going to do? And we don't have preset questions. What if people, ask weird things? What if things go wrong? What if we don't know what's going to happen? And they were really hesitant about giving away that control. And on the day they joined and they sat down at some tables, and they also kind of afterwards came up to our team and even to me while I was really junior, and I wasn't really a person that they would talk to a lot, but they came up to me and said like, well, this has been so like inspiring and kind of so different and unique and so powerful, because it's something that you don't see at museums very often, and it's an atmosphere especially that you don't see at museums very often, because it's usually so much more hierarchical and so much more kind of based on tradition and like authority of the museum telling you what you should know about this. All the other exhibitions are much more like, this is the Second World War and this is what you should know about it. And that's a very different approach. So they were completely surprised and inspired by the idea that it could also be so different, and that it could feel so much like one big community instead of, bringing together really different types of people. So yeah, they were really completely convinced after that one, and we did lots more of them, because indeed they were very powerful things. And I've not really seen them happen at other museums afterwards, but I feel like it is a very good format that could happen in lots of other museums. I would think as soon as you can get people involved who have some kind of lived experience that they can talk about, it's a format that works really well. So yeah, I would recommend it for you guys.
Yeah, it's especially impressive that people were so into that they were daring to talk. That it's some that it's a really topic that cares for them.
Yeah.
What I think reinforces the importance of the museum.
Absolutely. It's kind of, I mean, to get people to talk on that day, creating a safe space is completely crucial. And to create Tate probably calls this a value-free space, but I would say a judgment-free space. That's probably more accurate. But to create a space where you can share your story without somebody going like, oh, I don't like this, or kind of completely, judging you for it for whatever reason. But to keep it completely open and to expect from people that they are genuinely interested. And even if they might not agree, that they at least want to hear your story and then maybe share a different opinion, but that both of these opinions and these stories are actually respected and that it's okay if there are differences, and that maybe by properly listening to different experiences that you might find some common ground where you do actually agree between the two. And it's a difficult space to create. And I think museums, for that reason, maybe have always tried to just remain neutral and try to not get involved into specific opinions or stories, because then you can avoid having that discussion or having to create that space for a genuine equal discussion. But I don't think museums can pretend to do that any longer. I don't think they are neutral at all. And I think if you're not willing to create that safer space where you can talk about differences, then what's the point? Then we're just going to get like a story from one curator or a team of curators who have a certain opinion, and it might be an interesting one, but then we're just going to hear that one, and it's not going to do anything with you in terms of I think it's really good if a exhibition really makes you reflect on something and brings out different opinions, and as a visitor you might think, oh, I'd never thought about it that way, but actually that's really interesting. And to have that, have multiple of those moments in one exhibition where you might consider lots of different insights. But I think traditionally a lot of exhibitions have been very univocal, like trying to kind of just give one museum voice, which is a neutral, objective voice. And it hasn't really celebrated that there are many voices that could be in there. And I think that's what a conflict cafe type event really does, is to have so many voices in the room and so many different stories that at the end, and after you've listened to like 10 different Syrians talking about their life, you can kind of think about a much more three-dimensional image of what Syrian life and refugee life is like. But you can't always get that if you have one exhibition by one curator who's got one perspective. So I think it's crucial to include more people and more voices. And that's what makes museums so interesting, and that's the power that they have, because they're all set up to do it, but they don't often take the opportunity. Well, more and more now, but less in history, I think.
I think it will also help to solve the issue that, well, I'm not sure, I remember it was quite a long time ago when in the United Kingdom there was that free museums policy to diversify the audiences and to invite more people to museums. But I think it's not the entrance fee that stops them, but probably what you say. So if they come and they see, okay, there are so many diverse perspectives, so maybe the one of mine would also fit there.
Absolutely. I mean, the biggest criticism of having free museums is that it helps people who are already probably middle class, slightly elitist, well educated, probably have the money to go to museums. It makes museums free for them because they are going to go anyway, and they can now go for free. So you're sponsoring people who could pay for museums to go for free, and people who don't go to museums much, maybe partly because they don't have the money, but probably also partly because they feel that the space is not for them, or they never went to museums as a child, so they don't really know if they should be going now. They're not even aware that a certain museum might be close to them, or that it's free, or kind of the extra thresholds that lots of communities feel around museums are really not solved by making them free. It really comes down to creating a much more accessible space, and a space that really kind of welcomes you in, even if you're a bit hesitant. And a free ticket is not going to go all the way there. I mean, it might help. I'm not saying they should be paid for, because I think it's great that English museums are free. But without any kind of additional help to break down those thresholds, you're really only sponsoring the already kind of, well, richer middle class to attend museums for free. And that's the opposite effect, really. So yeah, no, I think they should definitely, that should be accompanied by a much bigger program around access, but access in the wider sense of the word. So not just kind of physical access and access for people with disabilities or other kind of limitations, but access just to make everybody feel welcome. And I think welcome is a much better word than access in a way, but it's kind of trying to open up the museums so that everybody feels like that space could be for them. And it's a difficult thing. I mean, again, at one of my case study museums in my research, we had a discussion, and kind of they had invited a group of I think it was a faith leader community. It doesn't really matter. It was a community, a local community there, and they asked them, like, so what would you like to do with us? Should we do an exhibition? And they had a whole conversation around what kind of exhibitions they could do. And then at some point, one of the communities said, like, well, actually, it's not really about the exhibition. Before I came here to this event to discuss this, I didn't really know that this was a museum. I walked past the museum and it said welcome, but it didn't say welcome to what? It didn't say art gallery. So I thought it was just this big kind of institution, and, well, I guess welcome means you can go in, but I don't know what I'd be going in for. So maybe the first project before we get to this exhibition should be about thinking what should be on the facade, whether it should say art gallery, you're welcome, or you can come in, or it's free, please come in. And to kind of think about, you know, how can we help a community to even realize that there is a museum there that could be interesting for them? Because if you only say welcome, you're completely assuming that everybody else knows already that this is an art gallery. And that's the first step, like the first hurdle that you've taken wrong. If you assume that knowledge, you're only going to get people who already have that knowledge. And that's a very limited group, it turns out. So I thought that was really insightful, that they kind of started at the basics and said, like, well, sort your priorities. Exhibitions is not really the issue. It's just the kind of the infrastructure and the signage. That's the first hurdle. And I thought that was really interesting.
That's also very inspiring, how one person from just a side can show you such a simple thing that you yourself probably focused on all the exhibition issues but never noticed in your career.
Exactly. Yeah, because then all of the staff and me went, like, what do we have on the facade? Because indeed, that's not something we think about, because for us it's obvious that that's a museum. But yeah, we kind of, when I left that afternoon from the museum, I did walk past the front entrance and went, like, oh yeah, it only says welcome. He's right. And it's stupid that you've never thought about that. And it's like working with communities in that way can really open your eyes about lots of things, and lots of things you completely take for granted if you work at a museum. And then they say something like that, and you're like, oh yeah, that's just not, like, I've completely taken that for granted. That's not entered my mind that could be an issue. But it's a really useful piece of feedback. And I don't know if they've changed it so far, I must say. But, you know, if more people mention that, at some point they will have to. So yeah, hopefully that's gonna create some real change.
Yeah, but now I really feel that I started the whole interview from a wrong side, because you have just mentioned so many interesting things, and I was so interested in the things that you tell that I completely missed the very beginning about the whole collaboration and co-creation process, because I can imagine that some people will hear those terms for the first time. So maybe you could just try to explain them for maybe from the angle of your PhD for the practitioners that are working in museums.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, co-creation is a term that I think many people in museums have heard, but are very insecure about what it really means, because it's a bit of a vague term, but also it's kind of been ruined in a way by lots of people using it for things that aren't co-creation, and lots of tokenistic approaches to collaboration that they call co-creation. And it's like, well, that's not really it. Because to me, co-creation is, it's a type of collaboration. So it sits in a much bigger collaborative spectrum probably, and it's one approach within it, where you bring together, well, again, an established group, which is often, well, in the case of museums, it would be museum staff generally, or maybe an artist or a kind of producer or an organizer. you bring them together with a non-established group, so a community group. Could be all shapes and kinds of community groups, could be an individual as well, but somebody who doesn't traditionally work for the museum and who generally probably doesn't traditionally work in art either. And I mean, there are lots of things that are key to co-creation and what makes it co-creation and not something else. But I think, again, that power distribution is the most important one. So, you know, there are some of those spectrums where they say, like, there's different types of collaborations. And there is the type where the museum has all the power and the community is just there as a visitor. And they call that information. You know, it's the museum informs the visitor about something. There's also consultation. That's probably the next level, where the museum has most of the power, but they ask the community what they want about, you know, what they want to see at the museum or what they want in a certain exhibition. So there is some kind of interaction and some collaboration going on, but the power still sits with the museum because they could choose to ignore whatever that community is saying, and then, you know, they don't have to do anything with it. So they don't really hand over any real agency. Then the next level, I think, would be participation. And that is where a museum has an idea, like they want to do an exhibition, let's say, and they say, well, in the final room, we'll have a big wall and people can stick all kinds of post-its there, or they can make something, you know, some crafty thing, whatever. And they can contribute that to the exhibition. So there is collaboration going on. The community or the audience is very much involved in doing something. It's quite interactive, but it's very much within a set framework, because the museum has decided, like, within that room, on that wall, with those post-its, that's where you can have your freedom. But in all of the other exhibition, we still decide that. So it's freedom, but with limitations. And co-creation then, as the fourth level in that structure, is where it's actually split 50-50. That is where you don't go in as a museum and say, we're going to do an exhibition and you can do this tiny part. But you sit down with the community at the very beginning and you say, what do we want to do? Do we even want to do an exhibition? What would be useful for you guys? What are the kind of motivations that we bring? And how can we build something together? And it's completely open-ended. And a community might say, let's do an exhibition. And then, you know, you start to think about what could be relevant themes and stories and what could be in there. But they might also say, actually, we'd like you to change the signage, or we think your museum mission and vision is all wrong. So, you know, you could work on all kinds of different projects. It really doesn't need to be a physical exhibition project. If it's an exhibition, often they call it co-curation rather than co-creation. Kind of the same thing, but I would think co-creation is a bit broader because you can create anything, and that's what makes it so interesting, I think. And then that's kind of where it's like, where the power is 50-50 and it's very equal or equitable at least. And then that could also flip to the other side of that spectrum, where the community is leading on something and they have most of the power, and the museum is following, or they just provide the resources. Like if a community want to do a big event, but they just need a space and the museum provides a space, that's where it flips to the other side and you sit in that realm. But I think kind of describing co-creation within that spectrum really helps people to understand what makes co-creation so unique. It's kind of defining it by defining what it's not, because that seems to be more effective than trying to come up with one definition that should cover all types of co-creation. Because, you know, co-creation can have so many forms and it can have so many products. And again, like, it could be an exhibition, it could be signage, it could be a mission, like that. It has an enormous range of what it could be in terms of shape and form. So I think if there would be a definition for it, and that's a big challenge, I think, to set one, it would be much more around process. Like, co-creation is a way of working in a very equal, equitable way that really shares power and shares agency. But the product of it doesn't really matter. Well, it matters as in that it's nice to get to something, but it could take any shape. So in a definition, it doesn't really matter. As long as there is some kind of thing that you're working towards, it doesn't matter what it is. So yeah, those are some considerations around a definition. But to give you like a one-line definition, I think is probably an impossible thing still. But who knows? Maybe when I properly finish and write up my thesis, maybe I'll try and put one in there. I'm not sure yet.
Yeah, and I was wondering, as far as I remember, in your thesis, you analyzed a few case studies. And I was also thinking, as the term itself is so complicated, it can be a very broad range of activities. Maybe you could put it a bit in practice to give some practical examples. How does it look in other museums?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've also, I did my research at 3 case study museums. One was Tate Modern, and I looked at their Tate Exchange project. One was the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester, and I looked at their Constituent Museum project, which is a big organizational change project. And I looked at Queen's Museum in New York, who've just started doing this Year of Uncertainty, which is their big co-creation program. They've been fascinating, all of them, but all 3 museums are very different. I mean, Tate is a huge beast. It's like a huge bureaucracy, but also with a kind of huge reputation. So it's a really, really interesting one. But the co-creation bit that they're doing is the Tate Exchange project is a very like delimited kind of space within the museum. It's a physical space, and it's a specific team who do that project. While at the Whitworth Art Gallery, it's a bigger organizational change project that sits across all of the museum, and all of the staff are kind of part of this like year of trying to push a lot of change through the museum. And the Queen's Museum, it's probably the smallest of the 3. In the US, which is also a very different environment, again, from the UK as well. So different pushes and pulls, I guess, that influence their work. And they have a long history of co-creation, or they don't always call it that, but a long history of community engagement, at least. Probably much longer than the other 2. But at the same time, because they've been so small, they've been very hands-on and very kind of, like just run with projects. And when I asked them, what does co-creation mean to you? They probably found it hardest to answer that question. While at Tate, they've got a very theoretical approach to it. They've really thought through the values and how they'll explain them, and kind of the language and the wording of it. So they all had their answer ready. At the Whitworth, they were probably still figuring out, because they'd only just started doing this. So they were still figuring out what it really meant, but they were asking the right questions at least. And at Queen's, because the Queen's Museum, they had been doing this for so long, they've probably seen all the different shapes that it could take, and that probably made it really hard for them to then say what is co-creation exactly, because it sits in so many of their projects and so many of their programs that it's really hard to say like it's this one thing, because it's almost everything they do. So that was a fascinating question to ask, but it really shows how difficult it is to try and give some kind of definition to this.
And in all those projects, like for example, I don't know, I only from all those 3 museums that you mentioned, I was only familiar with Tate Exchange. Yeah. And as far as I remember, you also mentioned that in their case, the impact, not only the results, the fast, quick results were very visible, but also the impact in times of COVID was very visible. And I was very curious about that, how the collaboration as well transmits to the broader practices of the museum. So maybe you could tell about this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really what my PhD is on. It's about kind of, if a museum does co-creation, how does that change the museum, like across all of the other teams? How does it impact how they work, and what does everybody across the museum learn from that? And it's been fascinating at Tate, because it's like the Tate Exchange team is a specific team, and they work with communities a lot, and they work in really flexible and open-ended ways, and they really try to kind of try to stick to all of those things that make co-creation so special, and I think they do it really well. But the rest of the museum doesn't necessarily have to, because it's not, it's a Tate Exchange team who do this, and if they're a different team, then they can say, well, co-creation is what they do, and we don't need to do this. So I was really interested in trying to find out, to see if that co-creation practice seeps through into other teams, and if other teams are inspired by that practice and start taking up bits of that as well. And there's been lots of interesting moments where it has, because, well, I mean, one example was that at Tate Exchange, they were going to do this big event with a neurodiverse community who have certain access needs. And they'd made the space already and kind of made sure that these people would be happy in the space and that it would all be, kind of tailored to their needs. But it's on the 5th floor in a really busy building. And so all of the people, when they arrived, had to use the lifts to get to the 5th floor. But the lifts are super busy, And at Tate, you know, sometimes you have to wait for 10 minutes before you can even get on a lift. And then when you're in it, it's super crowded. And, you know, it's a real intense experience for anyone, but especially for people who are neurodiverse and have much more, you know, for whom that's much more what's the word? Intense, I guess. And they kind of realized when they were already doing this event, like actually thinking about how this 5th floor space is tailored to them is not enough. We should have thought about the whole experience from the very front door. But that means we have to involve the security team, the welcome ambassadors on the door, like the visitor services team. We have to include, you know, all of the other teams that have to do with these spaces and that are part of the general visitor experience to make that route better next time. So this is a yearly project that they do. So, you know, they did the 1 year, they learned from that. And then in preparation for the 2nd year, they worked with the security team and said, okay, we're going to do this completely differently. We need to think of a way to make these people feel at home in the museum from the very first moment that they walk into it. And they did lots of workshops around how the security guards might help these people and kind of how, like, what their needs were and how they could really improve that experience, but in a way that kind of that they really understood what was needed, rather than just assuming what these people might need. And it turned out that like 2 of the security guards had children with similar issues. So when they actually kind of, you know, when they went to the security team and asked, like, so what can we do? It turned out that they could speak from their own experience, which nobody was really aware of, or at least kind of hadn't thought of. And they became much more invested in that project because they realized how much they were helping, you know, people who were similar to their own children. And they came up with the idea of a lift driver. So they would isolate one of the lifts on the days that they were there, and have like a driver kind of, you know, bringing them up and down into the changing rooms, which are also on the ground floor, and to really help them and kind of make them feel special, or well, not special, but at least make them feel acknowledged. Really, it's not even about making them feel special, but just making them feel accepted and welcome, and to ensure that there was a space for them. And they did that really well. The 2nd year, it all worked a lot better. And one of the participants said, like, oh well, last year you had to bring us up with the vegetables because in the end they had to use a goods lift to make it work. And this year we've got our own lift driver, and it's suddenly like it's a completely different experience. But I think why it's an interesting example is because it really shows that the knowledge and the learning of working with this community went like well beyond the Tate Exchange team. I mean, suddenly the security team is involved. Suddenly they saw how important it is. Suddenly they could bring in their own experience. And from there, they've then kind of kept doing trainings and kept kind of running a project that looks at the accessibility and just general welcome of so many other different groups as well. And they did training on like pronouns, because if you're a security guard at the door at Tate, the first question that you ask people often is, can we look inside your bag? You know, there's a bag search. And you know, they really rethought that approach and went like, well, what else can we ask to welcome people first, and then maybe look in their bag? Do we need to look in their bag at all? But that's a different question. And also kind of what pronouns do you use? You can't just say, ma'am, can we look in your bag? Because we don't know if that person identifies as female, really. So suddenly there were all of these other concerns that they had to think about. And that kind of gave them so much new insight in, hey, we can't just assume all of these things. So I think that's a really interesting success story where they really brought co-creation, or at least the impact of co-creation, to the security team, which initially they had probably thought was one of the least likely teams to get involved with co-creation, because it's not an obvious link maybe, but actually it was a really powerful one, and it turned out really well. And there's many of these stories. This is just one example, but across State, it's like the co-creation knowledge and experience has gone through to lots of different departments, and it's really helped people to, you know, reflect and ask questions about their work of like, well, are we doing it the right way? Are we making assumptions that we shouldn't make yet? Should we actually ask communities what they need from us and work together with them to make it better? And there are lots of examples. where they are now starting to do that. So it's nice to see the Tate Exchange project as a catalyst for that.
Yeah, but you also mentioned that you're trying to evaluate the impact maybe of those practices, and even from what I've heard so many positive impacts. So how is it possible to evaluate, because you have so many different layers where the impact and how does it show itself? So maybe you have any advices for museums, especially I guess for those who are only starting to do that, how not to get lost that impact.
Yeah, there's lots of different impacts, and I don't know if as like a single researcher doing 3 years of research I can capture it all. I'm just capturing as much as I can, but it would be better probably if they also brought in professional evaluators who will look at specific aspects and elements of their projects as well. But I think it's good to keep in mind that like change and impact can sit at many different levels. There's the impact on the community that you're working with, and what they get from it. And maybe, if they do a certain project, they might feel more confident and they might go on to do bigger things. There's lots of impact you can measure there, especially if you measure it over time. But there's also lots of impact on the organization itself, which a lot of people forget about. They always think it's like co-creation is done for the community and therefore we need to see how it's helping them. But actually, co-creation is a really good way of reflecting on your own organization and asking, are we doing things the right way? Should we be changing things? Should we change the whole power structure and all the things, all the kind of limitations and systems that we're stuck to? And it can have a really big effect on organizational change. And even within that, you can then ask, well, what's the impact on individuals? And one staff member thinking, oh yeah, I should do this differently next time, is a great impact already, but it's a very individual impact. But you do want to capture these stories as well, because there are probably many of them. And then there is the kind of bigger organizational impact of like, well, these whole departments are now working with communities in a different way, or they're working together between departments a lot more than they used to do. Silos are being broken up, and senior teams might get more involved and they might get more on board. And there's all of these really interesting ways that a whole organization can change. People end up changing their mission because of these things. So it's interesting to see that a whole, like the core values of a museum could change because of it. But then there's also the much bigger level of like just general kind of societal change. Like if as a museum you can show that co-creation is making a huge impact on your audience and on your visitors, you might inspire other museums to do the same. And there might be theatres who then think, oh, well, actually co-creation works for us as well. That's not just applicable to museums, it can be applicable to anything. It's applicable to hospitals working with patients on new ways to think about their therapies or treatments. It can work in government to include citizens in decision making and say, well, let's co-create a decision to a certain issue and see what we all think, and then decide what's the best thing to do, rather than leaving it just to the policymakers themselves. And there's so many fields in which you can apply co-creation, that if you can show that things are really having a good impact, or they're making things more relevant and more tailored to what's needed, then that can really inspire much bigger change. And that could also just be change around, what systems do we need for museums, but also for organizations in general. If we can show that a very open-ended way of working, which co-creation is a really good way to do this, then you can create bigger change in the whole funding structures of it by saying to your funders, like, well, we want to do this project and we want the money from you to do this, but you'll have to give us space to determine the outcomes as we go, rather than from the very beginning. And if you can advocate for that change, you might change the whole funding system, because if funders see that this is actually having a great effect, and that it's offering an opportunity for much more impactful work, then you might open up that space for lots of projects after you as well, and that can be a huge change. It's probably a slow one because it's not so easy to get it done, but it can be really powerful if that space was opened. And you can only do that by giving the evidence again, I guess, and the examples of like, this is how we're doing it and it works really well. So yeah, it's a big project, but impact and change sits everywhere, and it's kind of impossible to evaluate it all. But it's nice, I think, to show all of the different angles and elements and areas where that change might sit, to inspire people to realize that there's lots of different types of change that can come from it.
And just the last question, if you still have a couple of minutes, because I see that I'm already exceeding the time limit.
Fine.
But I was thinking, well, some things, as I've mentioned in the beginning, some things it seems that there are like trends in museums. So would you say like co-creation, is it a trend, or is it like, I don't know, a spine that brings some values for the museum and which stays there for a longer time? Or you would say it's also just a temporary trend that will change, and if it would change, what is the next step maybe?
Oh, looking into the future, trying to predict the future, it's a hard one. I think that, co-creation is part of a much bigger trend towards, let's question what museums have always been built on and who has always decided what museums should be. And let's move towards a model in which that's broken down to make it much more open. And, it helps to create more relevant institutions, which is like, relevance has been a key word in the last few decades, where it's like, okay, well, what are museums really for, and what needs do they serve? It's also part of that trend towards civic museums, where museums are thinking about what can our role in society be? How can we help society better? How can we solve social issues, social injustice, by providing a space to talk about these things? Queen's Museum opened a food bank. There's lots of kind of social issues that museums can address if you do it in the right way and if you feel like it fits into your program. So I think there's been a huge movement towards, let's rethink what a museum really means and what that can be, and how we can open that up to include more voices in the question of what it can be. And co-creation is one approach to that. It seems like it's currently a really popular approach. Just judging by the number of people who are interested in my research, I'm like, wow, this is a real buzzword, and people really want to know what co-creation is. And I think lots of people have heard about it, but they don't always know what it means exactly. So they're really interested in finding out. So I feel like co-creation is definitely kind of riding that wave of like, oh, this is an interesting new approach. It's probably not the only one. I could imagine that in 10 years, there might be a new word that's slightly more nuanced and slightly more suitable, but it will probably still be in the same vein of like, let's see how we can bring more people into this decision-making process. So I think the kind of the general gist of it is probably still going to be a thing for a long time, but the actual word co-creation might be replaced at some point. Who knows? For now, I'm using it because it makes sense, but there's always new terms that come up. But I think the thing that's really going to determine what the future looks like is also what we want it to be. It sounds cliche, but in my research, when I interviewed all of my participants at these museums, my last question as well was like, where do you see the future going? And this was the future of co-created museums. So where do you see co-creation in museums going? And all but one gave me an answer saying like, oh, well, I want it to go that way, and I imagine this, and I think that's going to be great, and I really want to, I'm really enthusiastic to make that happen. And there was only one person who said, actually, I can't decide where co-creation will go, because in the spirit of co-creation, that's something that we should decide together. And I thought, yes, finally. If you say, I want this museum to go there, then you're not co-creating that museum. So if you say, I want this co-creation museum to go there, you're doing it wrong in a way, or at least you're not giving enough space for other people to be part of that conversation. So I'm going to repeat that, and I'm going to say, well, I think the future of museums in general is very much where we want to take it. And I think if we use co-creation to let people, to give people the space to help everyone at museums decide where they should be going, we're probably going to get to the most relevant and most interesting and most tailored museum that we can have, and that will have the most impact and the most relevance for people in society. But that requires having other people being part of that conversation. I think as museum staff alone, we're not going to get there, and we shouldn't think that we can. We should include other people in, designing our future.
Well, thank you so much once again. It seems that it's really, I think it not seems that it really is an impressive journey from a very, as you said, a temple, a very close building, to a very integral part of communities and societies. So it's really impressive to see that, and hopefully to be part of that.
Yeah, I agree. And there's so much you can say about it. These were just a few highlights of everything else that you can talk about in this field. But it's an exciting one. I'm excited for the future.